Well, this morning I want us to think about what is meant by the word blessing. It's a word that we commonly use, frequently use, and so I wanted to look at it this morning and in the context of the Aaronic blessing which we had read to us there from Numbers 6:22 through to 27. Now, the opening verses in 22 and 23 shows that the blessing that is given in Numbers 6 is given to Aaron and his sons as a blessing for the people. The people of God are the focus of the blessing. It's not the priests, and quite interestingly, it's not given in the plural. It's actually given in the singular. When it's actually given to the whole community, it's because every single individual in the community is included. Now, we do have elsewhere the exact same words in the plural. Psalm 67 verse 1 will say, "May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face to shine upon us." There's nothing wrong in wishing to see the community of God being blessed. There's nothing wrong at all. But here, in the context of Numbers, what we have is this gift from God. Not a collective gift that Stonehaven Baptist would be blessed, but rather that the church would be blessed and affected, the whole body affected, because God looks at you. And he says, "I would bless you." He's not saying, "I will bless some of you," and so therefore the average overall is that there is a blessing for the church. He is looking to you as the individual. He is indeed looking at you, even now. The circumstances of your life, your unique pains and difficulties and needs. And he says, "I would bless you." Now, the reason we can have assurance in this blessing is not because of the words of a man, as Aaron or any of the other priests can utter these words. The power of these words is not found simply because a man goes around repeating them. And indeed, when it comes to blessings, take away from your mind this idea that we simply utter something and somehow we have conveyed a blessing onto you. There's something far greater going on here in this text. Something that should fill us with awe and wonder when we read it, as we consider what is actually being said here in these verses. The second point to be said to the individual, you see, it's to the individual, but also the guarantor of it is not the priest. There's not like a set formula. It's not that these are magical words or anything else that compels God to do a blessing. It's not the priest who's the arbiter of who gets blessed. It's not the priest who provides the blessing. As the text made clear in the next three verses, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. And it is he who pours out the blessing. He is a guarantor, which means it is guaranteed. Now, in our Bibles, we usually have the word Lord written in capital letters because it points to the name of God, Yahweh. Now, this name is significant, and actually very much so here, where the use of the name of God, not any of the many titles of God, but the use of the name of God is done so by no accident. It points to a person. It points to someone that can be known, a person who would be known, a person who would be in relationship with these people, who would be their God and they his children. That's the import of using the name here. So as we look at this text, we are mindful that though you can benefit as a congregation from this blessing, it is said to you individually this morning, and it is said by Yahweh, the one who would be in relationship with you. And that's actually rather vital in understanding a blessing. That closeness of God is key to really understanding what blessing means. And that's what we're going to see over the next few verses. The three verses of the blessing here in verses 24 through to 26, they work together with this theme, the blessing of God, and what that looks like. In Hebrew and in English, it works its way to a crescendo from the opening line to the second point and then the third line. It's kind of building its way up. In Hebrew, the first line, Yahweh bless you line, it's 3 words. The next line is 5 words, and then the third line is 7 words. It's a very carefully constructed poem. There's a beauty in it. In fact, someone like me gets rather excited because the first line has 15 consonants and then 20 consonants and then 25 consonants. It's very precisely worked out. But the effect of the poetry, that perfect poetry, is indeed for us to read this crescendo of blessing. That we start off at almost like level 1, level 2, level 3, and it's kind of building up and building up into something even more incredible by the end. In fact, to be honest, somewhat beyond our comprehension. So, what we have then is this crescendo rising up to verse 26 here. And in the actions of God, we see these effects upon us. So, each verse provides an action of God, and then what happens as a result. As he blesses, we are protected. As he shines, we receive grace. And as he lifts up, we find peace. So let's take the time then to explore what each of these mean. Verse 24, Yahweh bless you and keep you. So the action of God here, given to us as bless, is literally, may Yahweh kneel or crouch down among us. You know, I think as Christians we can almost kind of get used to almost anything. We get used to the idea that God would be with us. And sometimes we're not struck by the wonder of what that really means. You know, really, it's quite incredible that God would deign to be with us. That the one who by right sits on a throne in heaven would come to the dust of the earth. The one who by right lives surrounded by what is holy would come amongst us who are not. The one who by right receives a perfect praise comes in order to give. The scale of the blessing is breathtaking because we're asking that God would be amongst us where we are. And the effect of that action, of God being with us, of God kneeling down to our level, is that we find ourselves kept. That's what it says. Literally, again, the Hebrew here talks about protection. It actually literally means, may he grow a hedge all around us. It denotes that we are his and that everything on the outside is kind of kept away. And it makes sense, you know, for if God is among us, what can threaten us? If he is among us and really among us, even our own self-destructive tendencies are diminished. And so this is what we have first, that God himself would come to where we are, that he would put this hedge around us, that we would be clearly his and safe. The next verse carries it on. And I'll be honest, actually, if the blessing had stopped there, that would actually be far too wonderful. That would be more than enough, wouldn't it? That would just be beyond anything we could have hoped for. And yet that is just the opening line of a blessing that is going to work its way into its fullness. Because the next verse 25 says this, Yahweh make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. And this next action, having come down to our level, is for the face of God to be shining upon us. Now, commonly in the Old Testament, the people of God at the most would be allowed to see the back of God. When we think of Moses, we think of Hagar, they were able to see the back of God, as it were. And this is asking for the face of God to be fully revealed to us. And note, his face is shining. Again, a very common Hebrew metaphor for having a rather good disposition towards you. You know, that his face, as it were, is, we would use the word beaming. You know, it's this shining face, this happy, smiling face when he sees you. I mean, it is one thing to imagine God coming down amongst us, and then it is another. But when he sees you, and really sees you because he is God, when he really sees who you are, for him to then smile. I find that wondrous. And I find that difficult to comprehend, but I know it is true. And so he actually smiles towards us. Actual fact, the smiling face of God in the Old Testament is usually equated with salvation. When he is smiling towards you, it's because you're one of the saved of God. We see that in places like Psalm 80. 3 separate occasions it says, may your face shine upon us so that we might be saved. It's wonderful. He brings salvation with him. And the idea of the shining face, it's like God is the sun and we're a plant. And there would be no life unless he was shining on us. Now, sometimes we might imagine that the opposite of a shining face would be a cloudy face, a face like thunder, which we have in Proverbs. Proverbs 16, verse 15, we have the idea of the cloudy face. But actually, in fact, the cloudy face also brings blessing. It brings the rains. It might not be what we want. Sometimes we need to be told off, etc. But that in itself is still a good place to be. The opposite of the shining face is to have the face turned away, to no longer have the face of God in any sense. We have that quite often in the Old Testament as the people constantly reject God and rebel against him. We see the face of God being turned away and then disaster strikes. Take Micah 3 verse 4 as an example. Then they will cry out to Yahweh, but he will not answer them. At that time he will hide his face from them because of the evil that they have done. And that's the opposite. Now, I would much rather have the stormy face of God than that. But for each and every one of us, we get to read here about the shining face of God to us. To have the face of God is to have God himself as he crouches down to bring life, to rescue us. And in this verse, to give us grace. So the shining face is equated with this grace that comes. The Hebrew word there is chanan. It's the idea of this mercy that comes from God because he has pity for us. He sees us for what we really are. He sees us where we really are. He sees what we've done to ourselves and are continually prone to doing. And so in mercy, in that pity and love that just flows from him, comes grace, comes what we need. So the God who crouched down to us, who shows us his shining face, it results in protection, it results in mercy, the mercy of God. And it's really important that we understand where this mercy really flows from. This mercy of God is because his heart is genuinely moved by our plight. It's usually understood that the mercy of God is founded on the love of God, a love that cannot be shaken or moved. So Psalm 51 verse 1, we'll put the two together. Chanan me, have mercy upon me, God of gods, according to your, you should sometimes say something steadfast love, but it's the chesed, the love of God, the love that will not let us go, the love that moves him to mercy, that graciousness that comes out of him flows from that heart because he is moved by what he sees. That's what a blessing looks like. That God would not be distant, but instead would look upon us. That his face would not be hidden, but would be shining towards us. I mean, what a blessing that is. Everything that the world has to offer is nothing compared to this. The creator of heaven and earth would be here with you, would be here with me. He would see me. He would look upon me. He'd be moved by what he sees. And yet, there's another verse. There's more to it. There's a third line to the blessing. Again, I have to say, if it stopped there, again, it is far more than I could have imagined, far more than I certainly deserve. And yet, there is more to come. Yahweh lift up his countenance to you and give you peace. Now, the word countenance, it's just another word for face, and actually in the Hebrew it is just the same word, face and face, but in the poem it doesn't seem right to simply put the same word, so countenance is there. Only here the face is not simply shining, it is lifted up. And there are three things to note about what this verse does as it completes the crescendo. Firstly, the lifting up of the face serves to remind us that we have a God who is willing to be seen. We have here Yahweh, the one who would be face to face with us. He's lifted up his face. He is willing to be seen. And so there's a difference there between the face that is shining and the face here. I suppose you could almost imagine the shining face of God, the one who really sees who you are. He's the God that sees everything. But the one who is lifted up is the one who is seen. It's got these two parts. I mean, when we think of God, we think, well, of course he sees everything. Of course he knows everything. He's God. But a God who's willing to be seen is something really special. And there's a Hebrew title for that. There is actually a Hebrew title for this combination of these two things. We have El Roi, a title that's used by Hagar to encapsulate something about God, something that was revealed to her in the middle of her story. We see that in Genesis 6:13. And we have the backstory, of course. We have childless Abram and Sarai, who at the insistence of the wife had adopted the quite normal local custom of having a surrogate mother, in this case Hagar, on behalf of Sarai. The custom of the time dehumanized her to the status of a baby incubator. And in this instance, although I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been unique, once the baby was conceived, there was this degree of animosity. There was certainly a degree of tension between the wife and the surrogate. And for Hagar, it resulted in the pregnant woman having to flee into the desert alone and ready to die. And it's while she's in the desert, alone, unloved and unwanted, that God comes to her, proving that she's not abandoned. It is in this context that the hope that he provides and all of the promises that he gives to her about her future, about her descendants, reveals who he is to her. The passage then concludes on this remarkable insight from Hagar into the very nature of God. Having met with God, Hagar gives his title for God, based on her experience. And so literally Genesis 16 verse 13 says, so she called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her El Roi, for she said, truly I have seen the back of him who sees after me. So as I said, the idea of the God who sees everything is a given. But what prompts the title is this wondrous realization that God himself would be willing to be seen by the likes of Hagar and the likes of us. She then calls the place Bir Laha Roi, which means the well where I saw God and lived. Where I saw God. What a momentous revelation for that unwanted, unloved woman, comforted by the one who would crouch down to where she is, abandoned in the desert, who has a heart that was moved by her plight and says, Hagar, I care. I am here with you. The God who sees is great, but then the God who is willing to be seen, who is willing to crouch down, willing to be moved, that is incredible and cannot be compared. So that's the first thing about the lifted face, that God would be willing to be seen, that we could grasp something of God, that we could really be in his presence. But to that, I want to add a second point, because as well as that close proximity of this relational God, Yahweh, discovered by Hagar, the lifting up of the face to you, as I've noted, is the crescendo to the two previous actions. And so what happens is, in this poem, we have these three actions of God kneeling down, of the face that is shining and the face lifted up. And when you put the three together, there is a movement, there is a picture that is supposed to come about. Now, as you will have noticed when the Hepburn family came in, there was quite a few of us. There's quite a small clan, as it were. My eldest is still there. And he's quite good for my back, because I only need to go about this height when I'm speaking to him. But as the children get smaller and smaller, I need to get down lower and lower. And particularly, if you think of, say, my daughter, who is usually quite happy to see me, quite enthusiastic to see me, and will quite often run towards me. And the natural action when she runs towards me is for me to crouch down, for me to pick her up, for my face to be smiling as I look into her, and for us to be face to face as I hold her in my arms. A little bit more difficult with the eldest. But with those smaller ones, just lifting them up with that genuine joy on your face as you hold them. That is the image that we are given. That is the movement that we are given in this crescendo by putting the three together. The crouching down, the beaming, shining face as they come up to the lifted face. It's incredible when we think that we are those children in the arms of God, who smiles at us. And there's a third point about this face being lifted up. Because when you have that idea of being held by God, when you're face to face like that, there is no room for us anymore to imagine God far away or distant. The proximity of God to us is actually rather key to understanding what a blessing is. You see, we can often have the wrong end of the stick. We imagine without that image of God scooping us up, without that image of God, shining in our face, as it were. Without that, we can imagine God on his throne, and when we ask for a blessing, maybe he just kind of sends a blessing, some sort of special delivery, as it were. It kind of comes and lands on us, and somehow our life is improved slightly. To be lifted up is to be in the presence of God, not a blessing centered at arm's length. You know, a blessing is none of the vain things that would charm us, any of the material things that we imagine. Instead, what we have here in a blessing is that God himself would come. And that as he does, nothing can be the same. Everything changes. Everything. It's like a whirlwind kind of sweeping into our lives, sweeping us up. The Aaronic blessing is not wondrous because we receive some sort of blessing that makes our lives slightly better. It is wondrous because the source of all blessing takes hold of us and gives us peace. The consequence of being lifted up, the very last bit of it there, is shalom, peace. Shalom it's quite a full word. We use peace very often, but it's the antonym of suffering. It's the opposite of suffering. It's the end of all of those pains. Shalom speaks of being safe. It speaks of healing. It speaks of a God who will wipe away every tear. All of that's contained in the term. But there's one particular thing in the blessing, in the here and now, that is meant by shalom. There's something that we can have now, though we look forward to the time that God will wipe away every tear. Right now we have that same God with us, and there's something that he brings. You see, shalom tells us that we can know what it is to be complete, to be content. I don't know about you. I was walking in Aberdeen the other day. I was on Union Street, hurriedly walking up the street to avoid actually, bumping into anybody and having to be too close and things. I was hurriedly walking up Union Street. And the amazing thing as I walked up the street was that with almost every single step, I was bombarded by another lie. It is a street of lies, to be entirely honest. Because as I was walking up, on every bus stop and every bus and every shop window, there was this lie. There was this lie that said, if you buy this, if you do that, you will be complete. That's a lie. And if you believe that lie, if you go and you buy the item and you take it back, you realize it turns to dust very, very quickly. It does not give you the completement. It does not give you the contentment that it promised. But it's okay because there's a new one, so you have to go buy that. And so on and so forth. And our contentment is in continually having to strive after all of these things that are being bombarded towards us. Experience this, buy that, and you will be content. Constantly consumed. Move from experience to experience, never satisfied, following these lies that are like mirages that disappear. But what we have in shalom, yes, there's the promise of a future without sin. There's a promise of a future without suffering, where the tears are wiped away. But we are promised a present, aided by the one who will wipe away the tears. We are given this opportunity to be lifted up and to be content, because in him we have all that we need. Which brings us to the postscript in verse 27. With all of these things, there's always something that kind of bites with each and every one of us. And with all of these verses, I am continually amazed. No matter how many times I read this text, I am astounded that this is what God would do when he looks at me. I'm amazed. But there's a postscript in verse 27. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them. So God doesn't just simply stamp his name on them like some sort of owner. Instead, his name is associated with these people. His precious name is given to them. As they go out, they represent him. He identifies with them. The blessing is not some vague wish. It's real. We get to wear the name of God. We live in the presence of God. Now, when we read about the people in the Bible that did this very thing, when we think of someone like Moses, great example. He came down from meeting with God at the top of a mountain, and he came down. He was unable to hide the fact that he'd been with God. His face shone. And it disturbed those who were around him. It was unsettling. Because God's glory had clearly marked the man. And it's no different for us. It shouldn't be any different for us. We who are scooped up in the arms of God. We who have the shining face of Yahweh El Roi shining right in our face. The one who would give us shalom. Who would make us free from the nonsense of the world. We too are marked. We too are different. We too can be disturbing. When we don't play the games of the world. Now I want to kind of get the balance right. I don't want to be misheard, because, let's be entirely honest, that sounds like an impossible task, that we go out with the name of God on us. We go out to the world, and that we have to in some way shine with the glory of God. And it kind of gives the wrong weighting to it. It is that when we meet with God, we are changed so that we are different. The only onus on us is to be with God, is to be face to face with him. And I wanted to share my favourite analogy, because I feel that this helpfully kind of provides that balance, if you know what I mean, between what God does and what we're required to do. That's my favourite analogy. If you know me long enough, you'll hear it more than once. But on my maiden attempt, it's hopefully be new to some of you. When I used to be a teacher. That's what I used to do. I used to be a primary teacher. It shows, to be entirely honest. But I used to be a primary teacher. And I remember at one point I was looking after a double nursery. That's 80 3- and 4-year-olds at the same time. I did have some staff to help me, fortunately, who knew what they were doing. And then there was me. And they had all these kids. And one day, one of the wee girls came up to me and she said, "Mr. Hepburn," I said, "Yes, I want to paint a picture of Mummy." We can facilitate that. That's no bother at all. Over to the painting area, so we go over. And she looked at me with such disdain on her face. I mean, such contempt that only a 3-year-old girl can really muster, She looked at me and says, "Mr. Hepburn, there's only 3 colours. How am I supposed to do a proper picture of Mummy with only 3 colours?" So we've got it like every colour, every shade, with pots everywhere. And she's standing there, she's got everything, and she's still looking at me with just sheer contempt. She goes, no, Mr. Hepburn, how am I supposed to paint a picture of Mummy with only 1 brush? So I get all these brushes. So she takes these brushes in both hands and she starts doing this painting of Mummy. Mummy basically ends up as kind of a big brown smear as all the colours kind of come together. I mean, if I stand as an art critic, I would have said it wasn't particularly good, Mummy had 3 arms for starters, which is a bit disturbing, I mean, it was kind of a bit disturbing, actually, the picture. Her nose was coming out to one side, her eyes were on the top of her head, etc. And you're looking at that and thinking, I hope that's not an accurate representation of Mummy, And so I'm thinking, well, we need to try and get this thing dry, the painting, not just the child. We need to get this dry before Mummy returns. It's on the radiator trying to dry out, and off the child goes. And I'm thinking, that poor mother, when she receives this monstrosity, to be honest, right? When she gets this horror show given to her. So Mummy comes back to pick up the child. You see, the child had no concept of time, but she knew that at some point in the future, Mummy was going to come and take her home. It's a perfect analogy for us. And Mummy comes in, and the child runs up, covered in paint still. And she said, "Mummy, I painted you a picture." And she goes and she gets it, and she gives it to Mummy. Now, I would have expected Mum to go, "Really? This is appalling. This is dreadful. How many arms have you given me? Why are my eyes on the top of my head?" Instead, Mummy takes that painting. She's delighted with it. She sticks it on her fridge at home. When her friends come in, she says, "Look what my child did for me." Now, the reason I find that a perfect analogy for us, and the reason it gives us that good balance between what we're supposed to do as the people who are changed by God, the people who are held by God, the people who have the shining face of God, the reason it gives us a balance is that one day I'm going to get to glory. And although we don't know what it's like, I imagine things, as I'm sure we all do. As I stand before God, he's looking at me and he knows me and he knows what I'm like. And my life, that was supposed to be this perfect representation of him, the perfect picture of him to the world, comes out. And it's a mess, with the 3 arms and the eyes in the wrong place and everything else. It doesn't look anything like God. And yet his smile will spread glory and he'll say, "Look at what my child has done for me." Now, I'll be honest, at that point, I'm going to wish I'd made a bit of an effort. At that point, I'm going to wish I had 2 paintbrushes, as it were. I'm going to want to have used all the paints. I want to really put every effort in, because when I get that, I want it to be as close as I really could have done. But regardless, he will take my life, instead of throwing it away and saying it's rubbish, saying, look at what my child has done for me. And so the onus on us is not, to change the world, but to be the people of God who want to be like God, who want to be that perfect picture. And that is enough. To really want that, to spend time with him, to have him changing us, and to have him change the world through us. And I feel that gives us the right balance. This wondrous God that we read about in the blessing that we are supposed to be like, well, just take 2 paintbrushes, as it were. Give it everything that you have to give a perfect representation of who he is. But I find that slightly more helpful in ending, rather than, right, all of you who've now met God, go and change the world. It's let God change the world through you. And the way that we do that is by receiving this blessing. The way that we go out as the people who are different is by receiving this blessing. That we would be in his presence. That we would be protected. That we would know his gracious mercy. And that we would know what it is to have shalom. Let us pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, as we come before you just now, we come astounded by who you are, amazed by what you're willing to do for each and every one of us, and that you would bless us, that we would know your peace, that we would know your mercy, Lord, that we would know your presence. And we pray, Lord, that we would indeed know these things, we would indeed open ourselves up to you, that we would indeed seek to spend time in your presence, so that our lives gradually begin to look more and more as they should, that we would begin to be more and more like you, so that we are undeniably your children, so that we provide a great witness of a God who redeems entirely. And so that when we see you face to face, finally in glory, that we would do so with a life well lived and a witness that was done to the best of our abilities, we pray. In Jesus' wonderful name, amen. Now we're going to sing again before we come to our time of communion. And I believe it's Bless the Lord that we're going to sing.